The wind was a predator. It stalked the high plains, scouring the earth with teeth of sand and ice, tearing at the frayed edges of Alara's shawl. Each gust was a physical blow, a reminder of the fists she had fled. The land stretched before her, a desolate canvas of umber and gray under a bruised sky, offering no sanctuary, no softness. Her late husband, Thomas, had called this land his heart. Now it felt like a grave, his grave, and soon hers. Her lungs burned, a fire stoked by ragged, panicked breaths. The stitch in her side had long ago become a knot of pure agony. Behind her, miles back but vivid in her mind's eye, was the home that was no longer hers. Jedediah's face, Thomas's brother, twisted with a righteous greed that had curdled into violence. The deed to the farm was all he wanted, and her signature was the key. His heavy handprint, a livid purple flowering on her cheek, throbbed in time with her frantic pulse. She was nothing to him but an obstacle, a widow to be swept aside. Despair was a cold, heavy stone in her belly. She had run with no destination, only in a way. But now, through the shimmering haze of exhaustion, a shape resolved itself against the horizon. A plume of smoke, thin and defiant, rising from a chimney. Silas Blackwood's ranch. The thought was a jolt of fear that momentarily eclipsed her pain. Blackwood. The name was a low whisper in the town saloon, a cautionary tale for children. A man who kept to himself, who had carved out a life in this unforgiving wilderness with nothing but his own two hands. They said he was hard as the rock he lived on, that he spoke more to his horse than to any man. Jedediah, for all his bluster and cruelty, feared Blackwood's territory. He would not follow her here. It was the only reason she had stumbled in this direction, a moth drawn not to a flame, but to the darkness surrounding it. Her legs gave out. The finality of it was almost a relief. She fell, the impact jarring through her bones, the rough-hewn timber of a porch step scraping her arm. The world tilted, the angry sky spinning into a vortex of black. She could smell wood smoke, the clean, sharp scent of pine, and something else, the faint, metallic tang of blood from her split lip. Her last conscious thought was not of Jedediah, nor of her lost husband, but of the profound, impossible silence of this place. A silence so deep it felt like the end of the world. Then, a shadow fell over her. Large, solid, blocking the fading light. Boots scuffed on the wood. She tried to lift her head, to say something, anything, but the stone in her belly dragged her down into the waiting dark. The world dissolved into the scent of pine and the feeling of being lifted, of a strength that was not brutal, but absolute. She awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth. It seeped into her skin, a gentle tide against the cold that had settled deep in her marrow. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still, her eyes closed, cataloging the sounds. The soft crackle and hiss of a fire, the steady tick of a mantel clock, the whisper of the wind outside, its fury now a distant, muffled complaint. There was no shouting, no heavy, menacing tread of boots on floorboards. There was only peace. A hesitant breath escaped her lips, clouding in the cool air. She was lying on a simple cot, a thick wool blanket tucked securely around her. The fire in the stone hearth cast flickering amber light across the single, Spartan room, illuminating rough-hewn log walls, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with tins and neatly stacked dishes. It was a man's space, functional, uncluttered, yet possessing a quiet order that spoke of a deliberate mind. A dark shape moved in the periphery, and her heart leaped into her throat. Silas Blackwood sat at the table, his back to her, mending a piece of leather tack. He was broad-shouldered, his presence filling the small cabin without crowding it. He worked with an economy of motion, his hands, calloused and capable, moving with practiced certainty. He had not noticed she was awake. She watched him, her fear a live thing in her chest. This was the man they whispered about, the recluse, the near-savage. Yet he had brought her in. He had laid her by his fire and covered her with a blanket. He had not left her to the mercy of the elements, or to Jedediah. A glass of water sat on a small crate beside the cot. Her throat was a desert. Slowly, careful not to make a sound, she pushed herself up. The room swayed, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. A small, involuntary gasp escaped her. He stopped his work. He did not turn immediately, but she felt his stillness, the sudden, focused attention. Then he rose and turned to face her. His face was all sharp angles and shadows in the firelight, framed by dark hair that brushed his collar. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, regarded her with an unnerving calm. There was no pity in them, but no malice either. There was only a quiet, assessing watchfulness. He was not what she expected. He was younger than the town gossip suggested, and while his expression was stern, it was not unkind. It was simply unreadable. He walked to the cot, picked up the glass and held it out to her. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. She hesitated for a second, her gaze flickering from the water to his face, before her thirst won out. Her hands trembled as she took the glass, water sloshing over the rim. He said nothing, simply waited until she had drunk her fill, her sips noisy and desperate in the quiet room. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and took the glass from her, placing it back on the crate. He looked at the livid bruise on her cheek, the cut on her lip. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. He turned away, walking back to the hearth to add a log to the fire. Sparks danced up the chimney like frantic stars. "You can stay the night," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges as if from disuse. Storms worsening, it was not a question or an invitation. It was a statement of fact. Then he returned to his chair and his work, the silence settling around them once more, no longer empty, but filled with the unspoken reality of her presence. Alara sank back onto the cot, pulling the blanket to her chin. She watched the steady movement of his hands, the solid set of his shoulders, and for the first time in days, the frantic terror inside her began to quiet, replaced by a fragile, uncertain stillness. Days bled into a week, each one a mirror of the last, measured by the rising and setting of a pale winter sun. Alara existed in the quiet spaces of Silas Blackwood's life. He never asked her name, nor why she had collapsed on his doorstep, her face a testament to some bleak tragedy. He simply accepted her presence as he accepted the snow in winter or the hawk on the wind, a thing that was. In return, she kept her story locked behind her teeth. A shard of glass she dared not voice for fear it would cut her anew. She began to learn the rhythms of his world. He rose before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her alarm. He would move about in the pre-dawn gloom, stoking the fire, his silhouette a bulwark against the cold. Then he would be gone, out into the vast, white wilderness to tend his stock, returning only when the light began to fail. Her own fear slowly gave way to a desperate need for purpose. She was not a guest. She was a refugee, and her keep had to be earned. She started small. She swept the floorboards until they were free of every speck of dust and mud. She washed the few dishes he used, stacking them back on the shelves in the precise order she found them. She took one of his worn shirts, frayed at the collar, and mended it with tiny, neat stitches, leaving it folded on his cot. He never acknowledged her work with words, but when he returned in the evening, his gray eyes would sweep the cabin, a flicker of something, surprise, appreciation, passing over his stoic features before it was gone. One evening, he came in from the cold, his eyebrows frosted with ice, and set a pail of milk on the table. It was more than he would need. He said nothing, but she understood. The next morning, she used the extra to make biscuits, the familiar work of her hands a comfort, the scent of them baking a ghost of a life she once knew. When he ate one, his expression remained unchanged, but he took a second, and in the silent cabin, it felt like a roar of approval. Trust was not given. It was observed. She saw it in the way he moved, with a quiet competence that bordered on grace. He was gentle with his animals, his low voice soothing his mare when she shied from the wind, his hands firm but kind as he checked a calf's leg. She saw the stacks of books in a corner, their spines worn, histories and almanacs, not idle fictions. He was not the unlettered brute the town imagined. He was a man who had chosen solitude, not been condemned to it. He began to leave things for her. A basket of potatoes by the door, a slab of bacon wrapped in cloth on the table, small, unspoken provisions. One afternoon he returned early, a storm chasing him home. He carried 2 dead rabbits, which he skinned with swift, detached efficiency. He left one on the table for her. That night, they ate in their usual silence, but she had made a stew, rich and savory, and the shared meal felt less like 2 strangers occupying the same space and more like a truce. As she cleaned up, he spoke, his voice startling her. The flue needs sweeping. It was the first task he had ever directly given her. It was an admission that she was part of the cabin's ecosystem now. "I can do that," she replied, her voice soft. And in that small exchange, something shifted. A single thread of connection had been woven in the vast tapestry of their silence. The thaw came first to the land. Patches of brown earth emerged from beneath the retreating snow, and the creeks began to speak again, their icy silence broken by the rush of meltwater. A similar thaw was happening within Alara. The terror that had been her constant companion had receded, leaving behind a quiet resolve. The hollowed-out feeling in her chest was slowly being filled by the simple, solid routine of survival. She was stronger. She could feel it in the ease with which she carried buckets of water, in the way she no longer flinched at every sudden sound. But the past was not a ghost that could be banished by work alone. It was a predator patient and waiting. It arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a horse and rider cresting the hill. Alara was outside, hanging washed linens on a line Silas had strung for her, when she saw him. Jedediah. Her blood ran cold. The crisp, clean scent of the air turned to ash in her mouth. He rode with a swaggering arrogance, his horse trampling the fragile new growth. He pulled up a short distance from the cabin, his eyes, small and mean, fixing on her. A cruel smirk split his face. "There you are," he called out, his voice a greasy stain on the clean air. "Got tired of waiting. Figured I'd come collect what's mine." He swung down from his horse. "That farm needs a woman's touch, and you need a man to look after you. Sign the damn papers, Alara, and we'll forget all this foolishness." Alara stood frozen, the damp sheet clutched in her hand like a shield. The old fear, primal and paralyzing, wrapped its icy tendrils around her heart. She could feel the phantom ache of his hand on her cheek. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The cabin door opened. Silas stepped out onto the porch, moving without haste. He held the axe he'd been using to split logs, its weight resting easy and familiar in his hand. He didn't look at Alara. His gaze was fixed on Jedediah. He said nothing, simply stood there, a silent, unmovable part of the landscape. Jedediah's smirk faltered. He had not counted on Blackwood being present. "This ain't your concern, Blackwood," he spat, trying to recover his bluster. "This is family business." Silas took a slow step forward, off the porch and onto the damp earth. The head of the axe glinted in the midday sun. "She's on my land," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet it carried more weight than all of Jedediah's shouting. "So it is my concern." Jedediah puffed out his chest. "She's my brother's widow. She belongs at the farm. She's not going with you." The finality in those words was absolute. It was not a threat, nor a negotiation. It was a statement of fact, as unchangeable as the mountains behind them. Jedediah looked from Silas's calm, gray eyes to the axe in his hand, and then to Alara. He saw not the terrified, beaten woman he had driven away, but someone standing straighter, her chin lifted, a flicker of defiance in her eyes that had not been there before. He was a bully, and his courage was a fragile thing. Faced with true, quiet resolve, it crumbled. He sputtered, a string of curses falling from his lips, then turned, heaved himself back onto his horse, and rode away, casting one last hateful glare over his shoulder. The sound of his horse's retreat faded, leaving only the sound of the wind in the pines and the drip of water from the eaves. The silence that fell after Jedediah's departure was different. The tension did not linger. It evaporated into the clean, cold air, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. The world seemed sharper, the green of the new pine growth more vibrant, the sky a deeper blue. Silas did not watch Jedediah go. He turned, propped the axe against the cabin wall, and went back inside without a word. He had done what was necessary, and it required no further comment. Elara remained by the clothesline, her knuckles white where she gripped the damp linen. Her heart, which had been a frantic bird beating against her ribs, slowly settled. He had not done it for her, she thought. He had done it because his sense of order had been violated. Jedediah was a disruption, a trespasser on the quiet sovereignty of his world. And yet he had stood for her. He had become a shield. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. The fire crackled, the clock ticked. It was the same rhythm as every other night, but the space between the sounds felt charged with new meaning. Elara served the stew she had prepared, setting the bowl before him. As he ate, she watched him, truly seeing the man, not the myth or the savior, but Silas. A man who lived by a code she was only just beginning to understand. A quiet man who met the world on his own terms. When they had finished, she gathered the dishes. She paused at the hearth, her back to him. "My name," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is Elara." He stopped wiping the table. She felt his gaze on her back. After a long moment, he simply said, "Silas." It was the first time he had offered his name, and it felt like a treaty being signed. A beginning. She did not feel pity from him. She felt something far more valuable, respect. He saw not a broken widow, but a person who had survived. In his silent, self-sufficient world, survival was the highest virtue. Over the next weeks, she stopped feeling like a refugee and started feeling like a partner. She planted a small garden in a patch of earth he tilled for her. She learned to read the sky, to anticipate the weather. She learned the nuances of his silence, the slight softening of his eyes that passed for a smile, the set of his jaw that meant a storm was coming. She was no longer running from a life that had been destroyed. She was building a new one from the foundations up. One evening, she stood on the porch, looking out at the vast expanse of his land, now her land, too, in a way. The setting sun painted the clouds in hues of rose and gold. It was a harsh, wild landscape, but it no longer felt threatening. Felt like freedom. Felt like home. The door opened behind her and Silas came to stand beside her. He didn't speak, didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, comforting warmth in the cooling air. They stood together, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. Two solitary figures who had found in each other's quiet company a sanctuary from the noise of the world. The past was a scar, but it no longer ached. The future was an unknown territory, but for the first time, Elara was not afraid to walk into it.